Most of us have heard of Black Hawk Down. We know the story of how the U.S. mission in Somalia ended. But this explainer, well, it's about why that mission really began in the first place. The official story we all heard was pretty straightforward. It was a humanitarian mission. The goal was to save a country from starvation. But what if that was just the cover story? What if the real reason was buried deep under the Somali sand? So, let's start with that official narrative, the one the whole world saw. It was called Operation Restore Hope. And the mission, as it was sold to the public, was simple, it was noble, it was all about stopping a terrible famine. I mean, you really can't get much clearer than this statement, right? The U.S. government said, we are here for one reason and one reason only, a purely compassionate mission. And for most people, that's pretty much where the story began and ended. But was it really that simple? Well, when you start to peel back the layers and look at the bigger picture, a very different motive starts to come into focus, one that has less to do with aid and a lot more to do with assets. So the first clue in this whole story, it's not on a battlefield, it's actually in a bunch of old filing cabinets. See, there's a paper trail, and it leads to a map that was drawn up years before the famine ever hit the headlines. An oil map. Okay, so check out this timeline, because it's kind of wild. Way back in the 80s, long before the crisis, American oil giants like Conoco and Chevron had already locked down formal deals for almost 2/3 of Somalia's entire landmass. Then, in 1991, the government completely falls apart, putting all those valuable claims on ice. And what happens just 1 year later? The U.S. military shows up. That timing, it is pretty hard to just write off as a coincidence. And this is the key takeaway here. The U.S. military wasn't just walking into some unknown territory. They were stepping into a nation where American companies already had massive, legally binding claims to what could be huge oil reserves. That completely changes the context, doesn't it? But the evidence isn't just buried in some old contracts. Nope. You can actually see it in the choices that were made on the ground, and even in the waters right off the Somali coast. So get this. When the U.S. needed a diplomatic headquarters in Mogadishu, where did they set up shop? In the heavily fortified compound owned by Conoco Oil. Now, the official reason was pure practicality. It was safe. But in the world of geopolitics, symbolism is everything. Setting up your base in an American oil company's headquarters, well, that sends a very, very clear message about what and who you're there to protect. So you have to ask yourself, right? Was that just a lucky break? A convenient coincidence? Or was it a deliberate signal to the world about the valuable corporate assets that were being protected under the cover of a humanitarian mission? And listen, beyond any oil that might be in the ground, Somalia's other great value is the oil that flows past its shores. Its coastline sits right on top of one of the most critical shipping lanes on the entire planet, a tiny choke point that a huge chunk of the world's daily oil supply has to pass through. So, making sure Somalia was stable wasn't just about what you could pull out of the country. It was about securing what flows past it. An unstable Somalia was a major risk to this vital artery of the global economy. Now, to really understand why this was all so important, we have to zoom out a little bit, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The Cold War had just ended, and America was basically writing a whole new playbook for how to run the world. And a really big idea in that new playbook was something called geostrategic prepositioning. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple, really. The thinking was, with the Soviet Union gone, the U.S. should get its pieces on the board in key regions before any rivals could, especially around the all-important energy routes of the Middle East. And if you look at it through that lens, Somalia was just perfect. It was a low-cost, low-risk move. There was no real army or government to fight. Thanks to the UN, the mission had international approval. And most importantly, it put U.S. forces right next door to those crucial energy sea lanes. It literally ticked every single strategic box. So when you start putting all these different pieces together, you've got the oil contracts, the strategic location, this new post-Cold War game plan, a much, much clearer picture of what was going on starts to emerge. And that brings us to the one question the official story just can't seem to answer. At that same time, other countries were going through equally horrible famines. So why Somalia? Why send such a massive military force there and not somewhere else? Well, the answer seems to be this unique combination of factors. Yes, of course, there was a terrible humanitarian crisis. That was real. But Somalia also had existing American oil claims, a critically important geostrategic location, and it was a low-risk place to operate. It was the only spot on the globe that checked all four of those boxes. And that right there is the core argument of this whole analysis. The suffering and the famine, that provided the public reason, the moral legitimacy for going in. But the energy geopolitics, that's what provided the selectivity. That's what made it Somalia and not anywhere else. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, if it was about oil, then why didn't they just start drilling? And that's a fair question. But you have to remember, energy strategy isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. The goal wasn't to get oil right away. It was about playing the long game, preserve the contracts, secure the area, and then just wait, sometimes for decades, until the time is right. So now, the point wasn't to start filling up oil tankers in 1992. The point was to set the chessboard for the next 50 years, to make sure that when the time came, those assets and those sea lanes were firmly in a friendly sphere of influence. When you boil it all down, it comes to this powerful idea. The humanitarian crisis was the story. It was real. It was tragic. And it's what got things moving. But the deep structure, the strategic framework that was quietly guiding the whole operation, that was built on a foundation of petroleum and power. And that kind of leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? As we look at events happening all over the world, how often are we only seeing the story while completely missing the structure that's holding it all up from underneath? It's a lens that might just change how you see things.